So there's quite a few different terms and things that we use during scenario planning, and what I'd like to do is map that out, or map those out on the board, just to give you a sense of how they all fit together and hopefully put them into context a little bit more clearly. So we'll start off with now, normal. We'll start off with today and then work from there. So when we're putting a contingency plan together, we'll say that this is for typhoon season. It could be whatever the specific scenario is, but we'll just use this this example. What we're then going to do is look at how could this situation, typhoon season, develop, and we're going to map out the different ways the scenario might play out. So based on our understanding of typhoon season, based on conditions in the area, we're going to say that the most likely is that there's an adjacent landfall. It's not going to hit our area of operations directly, and that there's going to be some limited damage. So we believe that that is the most likely. And we can map that out and then start planning around that. So that will be one of our scenario paths. So in this case, what we're saying is that the worst case scenario would be a direct hit in our area of operations and widespread damage. So we're now looking at the sort of catastrophic effects you can see from hurricanes and typhoons, where everything in that area is knocked out. And of course that means not just your operations are going to be hit, but the overall infrastructure in the area is hit, your staff are going to be affected, your supply chains, basically everything is going to be disrupted. So that is obviously the worst case scenario. But at the same time, we can also look at the other option, or the other extreme there, which would be the best case scenario, and map that out too. And so here is saying that the best case is that, in fact, and this obviously can happen, that the storm blows out. What starts off as a typhoon or a very strong storm essentially blows out before it makes landfall. So it may still cause some damage. You're going to have storm surge, you're going to have flooding, a lot of rainfall, high winds, but very, very limited damage, certainly compared to what's going on up here. So once we've got the pathways, then we need to start to look at what the courses of action will be. I'm going to map those out, and so we've now got the potential pathways for the scenarios, and now we move on to the courses of action. We're going to say, if we see this pathway, whichever it is, what course of action would be most appropriate, and we can start building those out. So in this case, I've just mapped out course of action 1, and the key thing with course of action 1, we're saying we're going to shelter in place. We can stay where we are to make sure that there's no need to move out of the area, and we're going to look at having our essential ops back up within 36 hours or less, and essentially we're then also looking at a big cleanup. So this is course of action 1, which is going to be shelter in place but get back to business as usual fairly quickly, because the most likely scenario here is it's a adjacent landfall, it's not a direct hit, and we've got limited damage. So that course of action is a course of action we can put in place there, and subsequently we're going to go on and plan that out in more detail. We then go through the same process for courses of action for the other scenarios that we have. So as far as the worst case scenario is concerned, we actually have 2 potential different courses of action. Course of action 2 here is shelter in place and rebuild. Remember, we're looking at significant widespread damage. So we're not looking at realistically getting back to work anytime soon. So that is course of action 2. However, we also have another course of action that we could take, which is up here, course of action 3, which is an evacuation. And then finally down here for the best case scenario, which is very limited damage and no direct hit, it's going to essentially be business as usual. But I have made a note here that you may need to consider your supply chain and the infrastructure effects. So now going back to the beginning here, we're going to be starting at this position of normal. This is the scenario we're talking about, typhoon season, or the situation. And we then look at 3 different scenarios. The most likely scenario, we believe, is adjacent landfall, limited damage. We have a worst case scenario, which is a direct hit and widespread damage. And then we have the best case scenario, when essentially it blows out and we have the water and the wind effects, but limited damage. With those 3 scenarios, what we can then do is we can start to map out courses of action. Course of action 1 for the most likely, which is shelter in place. Course of action 2 for the worst case scenario, also shelter in place, but we're assuming much more significant damage. and course of action 3 for scenario 2, the worst case scenario, which is an evacuation. And then finally at the bottom here, course of action 4 for the best case scenario, which is essentially continue as normal and plan around whatever effects there are. So now we've gone from the situation we're dealing with, the scenarios, the 3 different scenarios, and the courses of action. What I want to do now is throw in a couple of other things that I've talked about, which are decision points and triggers. So that's where the triggers fit in, and then you'll be monitoring these as you go, because depending what the triggers are in the situation, that will help you identify which one of these scenario paths you might be going down. So that's where the triggers fit in. Okay, so I've added a couple of little diamonds here for the decision points. We'll talk about what's happened up at the top there in a second. But the decision point for course of action 1, I've put 2 little dots here for timelines, 48 hours and 24 hours. As far as course of action 1, the most likely, shelter in place, you don't need to give yourselves a huge amount of warning. You can be tracking things in 12 hours out is probably plenty of time to initiate the shelter in place. You will have been doing other things on the pathway in as far as preparing for it, but you don't need to make a final decision until you're relatively close to landfall. So that decision point is going to come up here a little bit later on. Jumping down to course of action 4, again, continuing business as usual and essentially just riding it out with very little effect. You can also leave that until quite late on. But let's go up and look at what's going on here. So you'll see that what I've done is I've actually split the pathway for the worst case scenario into two here. So let's look at course of action 2. Similarly, course of action 2, shelter in place. This is even with the most severe storm. You can still make that decision about 24 hours out. However, if you want to evacuate 24 hours out before a major event probably isn't enough time. You need to give yourself more time. So therefore, the decision point for evacuation may be back here, closer to the 48-hour mark. And this is where the decision points come in. So the decision point is, at what stage do we need to make the decision if the course of action is going to be successful? And to use this example, if you wait until the 24-hour point and decide you want to evacuate, you may not be able to do it. There just might not be enough time. If you wanted to shut down a factory and it takes 36 hours to close down all of the processes safely and lock everything up so that when it's time to go back, you can come back in and turn it on instead of an emergency shutdown, which causes damage. That may take 24, 36 hours. So again, you have to think about how long does it take to put everything in place for that course of action to be successful. And to be clear, this is the decision point that we've decided to evacuate. Prior to that, there's a whole amount of planning and preparation done for something as large as an evacuation. That's what the playbooks are for. That's the planning we're talking about. That's what that's for. So this isn't the stage when you decide, okay, now we need to plan and put together an evacuation. That's already been done. But this is the point when you decide, okay, we now want to take this course of action. We want to evacuate. Now we make that decision and we start heading up towards course of action 3. If you decide to write it out, then you can leave that final decision to lock everything down until closer to the mark. So I hope that's put everything into context a little bit more. We're starting over here with what's normal, and we're now looking at this situation, typhoon season. We've identified the triggers associated with that. That'll help us identify that that is what is happening and also give us a sense of the magnitude and how things can play out. We then developed the different scenarios, most likely worst case and best case, but we could be using different terms. The key thing is, you can see with these pathways, they are very different. We're not looking at 3 pathways that are very close together. So we now have 3 very distinct scenarios to plan for. And then for each of those scenarios, we map out courses of action. And in this case, we actually have 2 separate courses of action associated with the worst case scenario. And then the final thing we did is we looked at where the decision points come in. So working back from what do we want to achieve with this course of action and how long do we need to make that happen, we can then put in the decision points. And the key thing, as I said earlier, that you may have a decision point that's relatively close in, but if you've got something more complex like an evacuation, the decision point will be further out. Once you've passed that point, this is no longer a course of action. So once you get, in this example here, less than 48 to 36 hours to the event, you're no longer going to be able to take that eventuality. So you're going to be forced to take course of action 2.